the blood eagle, which involves ripping the chest apart and pulling the lungs out like wings. This is something we find in much later accounts. It's not described by their enemies, who are looking for.
For over 1,000 years, tales of the Vikings' ferocity and the havoc they wreaked have fascinated many. However, they practiced very dark traditions that were so gruesome that history kept them in the shadows. From blood-soaked rituals to brutal dispute settlements and even cannibalism, their hidden world reveals a darker side only few dare to explore. What disturbing secrets did these seafarers take to their graves, and why are these stories still so haunting today? Join us as we unveil the darkest traditions of the Vikings even history doesn't talk about. Infant rituals. Certain rituals had to be performed before a newborn was considered fully human. Until then, the baby wasn't seen as a person, possibly as a way to cope with the high rate of infant mortality. After birth, the baby is placed on the ground until the father picks it up and tucks it into his cloak, signifying his acceptance of the child as his own. The father would then examine the infant. If the baby had visible defects or health issues, it might be abandoned to die. If the child appeared healthy, a ceremony called vatni was performed, where water was sprinkled over the baby. The naming ceremony, called festi, followed. During this ritual, the father announced the child's name and gave a gift, such as a ring, weapon, or land. From that point on, the baby was fully recognized as part of the family, and abandoning it would be considered illegal. Female children grew up learning to care for the home, while male children were raised to become warriors. But among those boys, a few strayed from their path, changing, twisting into something more than human, as if consumed by a monstrous force that could not be stopped. Viking Berserkers. Within the Viking armies, a wilder, untamed brotherhood of fighters existed. The Berserkers, men who thrived on the battlefield, fueled by a frenzied rage that seemed almost supernatural. The name Berserker comes from the Old Norse words ber, meaning bear, and serker, meaning shirt, because the fearless warriors either wore bear skins or fought with the fury of a bear. Known as Berserker in Old Norse, they entered battle in a wild, trance-like state, often discarding armor and relying on sheer strength and psychological intimidation. Their fighting style was chaotic and terrifying. Icelandic sagas describe how they worked themselves into a frenzy, called Berserkergang, by howling like animals, biting their shields, and charging recklessly into enemy lines. In this state, they appeared immune to pain and capable of incredible feats of strength. Their ferocity struck fear into enemies, but their battle frenzy often left them physically and mentally drained afterward. Berserkers typically led the charge in battles, whether attacking or defending. However, their uncontrollable nature made them unpredictable. At the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030, King Olav Haraldsson used berserkers to lead his forces, but their wild attack disrupted the formation and contributed to his defeat. Sagas often depict berserkers traveling in groups, offering their skills to various leaders. These warriors were infamous for their pre-battle rituals, such as biting shields or attacking objects. Some families passed down the title of berserker through generations, continuing the violent legacy. The term berserk extended beyond these warriors. Leaders like Harold Hardroad sometimes displayed berserk-like traits in battle, even without wearing animal skins. Roman and Byzantine sources also mention northern warriors fighting with wild abandon, often nearly naked, which may have inspired later berserker traditions. Theories about their battle frenzy include the use of hallucinogenic mushrooms, like Amanita muscaria, or intense ritual preparation. While some believe substances heightened their aggression, others argue their state came from psychological conditioning, enhancing their strength and pain tolerance. As Christianity spread in Scandinavia, the berserker tradition disappeared. Once celebrated in Norse pagan society, their rituals and behaviors were now seen as dangerous and demonic. Surprisingly, Viking men, whether they were berserkers or ordinary warriors, all carried a feral edge within them, an untamed side that only revealed itself during their most intense and sacred moments of bonding. Games. The Vikings had a passion for violence, and their games reflected their brutal nature, making modern combat sports seem tame. Injuries and fatalities were common in these competitions, and the unwritten rule was simple. If someone got hurt or passed away, it was their own responsibility for staying in the game too long. One of their competitions involved a twisted version of swimming, where the goal was to hold an opponent underwater for as long as possible. If the other person couldn't surface in time, they would drown. Another game, played only once a year during autumn, involved two teams fighting over a ball in a chaotic and violent version of Keep Away. Wrestling was also a staple activity among the Vikings, helping them maintain their strength and combat skills during times when they weren't raiding. The danger didn't stop with the games themselves. Brawls often broke out, escalating into serious conflicts. In one recorded instance, a 6-year-old boy, after being bullied during a game, struck another boy with an axe, ending his life. These disputes could extend beyond the games, sparking blood feuds that dragged on for years. The games were so extreme that even seasoned warriors who fought in battles found them too intense to participate in and could only watch from the sidelines. Frequent clashes and skirmishes forced women to master the art of treating battle wounds, but over time they devised chillingly precise methods to decide which warriors deserved their efforts and which ones were beyond saving. Viking soup. They developed a unique method to determine the severity of stab or slash wounds. To assess the damage, they would prepare a broth made with onions, leeks, and herbs and feed it to the injured warrior. Afterward, they would smell the wound. If the scent of the broth emerged from the injury, it indicated that the wound was too deep and beyond healing. Knowing the warrior would not survive, they chose not to waste resources or time attempting to treat the untreatable. Instead, they focused their efforts and remedies on those with injuries they believed could be saved. During the chaos of mass conflict between Viking factions, the intricate scarifications etched into their skin became the only way to identify who belonged to which group and who would live to fight another day. Ritualistic tattoos. The idea of tattooed Vikings is popular, but solid proof of this practice is harder to find. Because organic materials like skin decay over time, no direct archaeological evidence of Viking tattoos has survived. However, historical writings offer some hints about their existence.
This is Clive from the Vikings, and these are the tattoos they were making for the show.
One notable account comes from a 10th century Arab traveller, Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who met the Rus Vikings near the Volga River. He described them as covered in tattoos from their fingers to their necks, featuring patterns like trees, snakes, and other meaningful symbols.
I have no idea what the hell they are. One looks like a kind of a snake.
Creating tattoos during the Viking Age would have been a slow and painful process. They likely used tools made from bone or metal, with ink made from soot, ash, or natural dyes. Designs were cut or pricked into the skin, similar to modern methods, but without proper hygiene or ways to ease the pain. These tattoos likely held deep meaning, representing the person's beliefs, accomplishments, or social rank. For years, it was thought that Vikings only adorned their bodies with tattoos, but newly uncovered, altered remains are beginning to reveal a far darker story. Tooth modification. Viking tooth alterations, first noted in the 1990s, show deep horizontal grooves carved into the teeth of Viking men buried on the Swedish island of Gotland. Researchers suggest this may have been a way to identify members of a specific group, possibly merchants. The markings might have acted as a sign of membership, granting access to trade benefits or other privileges, similar to how guilds operated later in history. Skull modifications, though less common, are even more puzzling.
That we see in certain skulls and skeletons from the Viking Age.
3 women buried on Gotland were found with elongated skulls, a result of intentional shaping. These women were likely not native to the island, raising questions about how Viking society interacted with foreigners. The purpose of these alterations remains unclear, but may have been connected to beauty, status, or cultural identity. These findings reveal that Viking body modifications weren't just about appearance. They conveyed meaning, marked belonging, and told stories of their time. Even today, these physical changes continue to provide clues about the lives and cultures of the Viking Age. Much like their striking body modifications, the Viking approach to justice was unlike anything seen in modern times. Brutal, unyielding, and steeped in ancient traditions. Holmgang. Insulting someone of higher status was strictly forbidden, but taking someone's life wasn't always considered a crime. If a person's life was taken, the victim's family could legally take revenge by ending the life of the assailant, often leading to long-running feuds between families. Another method of resolving disputes was through holmgangs, which were duels. These fights, sometimes deadly, were used to settle grievances. If someone felt wrong, they could issue a challenge.
Lots of fine words. Now, let's get ready.
And the duel had to happen within a week. Interestingly, a substitute could step in to fight on behalf of the person challenged. Before the duel began, the rules were announced, which varied by region. These could include what weapons were allowed, how many shields could be used, who would attack first, and what would decide the winner. Often the duel ends only when one of the participants dies. If the person challenged failed to appear for the duel, they were automatically considered guilty. For serious offenses, this meant that anyone, regardless of their social status, had the right to end their life without facing consequences. Even a slave could legally take the life of a clan leader who refused to show up for a duel. The brutality of this ancient society went far beyond mere violence. An isolated few took it to unimaginable extremes, committing acts so gruesome they defied belief. Ritualistic cannibalism. The idea of cannibalism among Vikings is unsettling and often exaggerated. While not a common practice, there are mentions of it in Norse sagas and some archaeological evidence suggesting it happened in rare situations. Viking stories, which mix history and myth, describe cannibalism as a way to gain strength from enemies or intimidate others through fear. Archaeologists have found human bones with cut marks at some Viking burial sites, especially in the British Isles. These marks might suggest cannibalism, but scholars debate their meaning. Some think they could be part of post-death rituals rather than proof of eating human flesh. Others believe famine or extreme need may have driven such acts instead of cultural traditions. The sagas also connect cannibalism to acts of revenge or survival during tough times. In the Volsunga saga, Gudrun takes the lives of her sons, cooks their hearts, and feeds them to her husband, King Atli, in a shocking act of vengeance.
Of a group called the Caribs, who made violent raids and then cooked and ate their prisoners.
Monstrous beings like giants and trolls are often depicted as cannibals in these stories. For example, a giant's home in Ketil's saga, Hengs, is filled with salted human meat. Similarly, trolls in Halfdanar's saga Bronifostra are seen cooking a stew of horse and human meat. Sometimes, sagas hint that humans might consume body parts for magical reasons, like gaining strength by eating certain organs or drinking blood. When it came to their belief in giants and trolls, the Vikings had their own chilling version of what we might call zombies. Warding off Draugr. These undead beings, known as Haugbui or Draugr, were believed to rise after burial. They stay quietly in its burial mound, guarding its treasures against grave robbers. In contrast to modern-day zombies, a Draugr was far more dangerous, leaving its grave to harm the living. To stop the dead from returning, the Vikings followed specific burial rituals.
Normally when we excavate Viking graves, we'd be lucky if there were 2 teeth left in the grave.
They placed straw in the shape of a cross beneath the shroud and laid open scissors on the chest of the deceased. The big toes were tied together to prevent walking, and nails were pressed into the soles of the feet. When carrying the coffin out of the house, they performed a ritual by stopping and lifting it 3 times in different directions to form a cross. In some cases, the dead were removed through a special corpse door, a hole made in the wall of the house. After the body was taken out, the hole would be sealed again, ensuring the dead couldn't find their way back inside. Vikings believed the dead could only return through the same path they were taken. To confuse them, bodies were carried out feet first, making it harder for the dead to recognize the way to their burial mound. Once the coffin was outside, objects used by the deceased, like jars, chairs, and pans, were turned upside down. If buried in a churchyard, it was the parson's duty to cast a spell binding the dead to their graves, ensuring they stayed put. Still immersed in spells and rituals, there were moments when ordinary sacrifices were deemed insufficient, driving the Vikings to turn to far more daring and perilous offerings. Human sacrifice. Human sacrifices were rare.
They carefully dug and found evidence of widespread human sacrifice among the Aztecs.
But significant in Viking culture. Historical accounts, though sometimes unreliable, and archaeological findings suggest these rituals did happen on occasion. In the 11th century, Adam of Bremen described Viking practices based on second-hand stories. He wrote about a ritual in Uppsala, Sweden, held every 9 years at the start of spring. The event lasted 9 days, featuring feasts and sacrifices. A total of 81 sacrifices were made, 1 man and 8 male animals each day. Their bodies were hung from trees in a sacred grove near the temple. These offerings were made to Odin to seek blessings and victory. While criminals or slaves were usually chosen, there was a time when a king was sacrificed during a severe famine. Snorri Sturluson's saga describes another famine in the 7th century. At first, the Vikings sacrificed oxen, but the famine persisted. The next year, they sacrificed men, but nothing changed. Finally, they blamed the king for their misfortune and sacrificed him, drenching the altar in his blood. Sacrifice was a complex and meaningful ritual for the Vikings. It wasn't random or senseless violence, but deeply tied to their connection with the gods, especially Odin. Human sacrifices often involved criminals, enemies, or prisoners of war, viewed as deserving or meaningful offerings. These acts were seen as a way to honor Odin, seek his favor, or enforce justice. For example, the saga of Halfdan recounts a criminal executed by the blood eagle method, a ritualistic sacrifice dedicated to Odin. Similarly, after a battle, 111 Frankish prisoners were hanged as offerings to Odin, blending strategic fear with spiritual devotion. Some Viking rituals included willing participants, such as the famous funeral sacrifices in Rus, where a slave woman chose to die alongside her chieftain. In Viking society, slaves, called thralls, held the lowest social status but played an important role in life and death. One of the most detailed accounts of such rituals comes from Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who described the sacrifice of a slave girl during a Viking chieftain's funeral. When the chieftain died, his body was placed on a ship along with his weapons, treasures, and sometimes animals. The most shocking part of the ritual was the slave girl's sacrifice, as she was chosen to join the chieftain in the afterlife. According to Ibn Fadlan, the girl was given intoxicating drinks and led into a tent where she would sleep with the chieftain's men. The ritual ended with the chieftain's closest female relative strangling and inflicting fatal injuries on the girl. Her body was then placed beside the chieftain on the funeral pyre. There is ongoing debate about whether the girl truly participated willingly. While Ibn Fadlan suggests she accepted her fate, the circumstances make it clear she likely had little choice. These ceremonies often included symbolic acts, such as lifting the woman in a chair to connect with the spirit world, showing the Vikings' strong beliefs in reincarnation and unity in the afterlife. Archaeological evidence sometimes challenges these stories. For example, large-scale sacrifices like those described at Uppsala lack strong physical proof. However, smaller rituals, such as hanging offerings in trees, seem more consistent with what we know about Viking spiritual practices. The Vikings' connection to Odin, whose name means the frenzied one, highlights their focus on intense, ecstatic experiences in rituals, battles, or sacrifices. Even animal offerings or symbolic acts, like exhausting a horse through running, were believed to channel spiritual energy or Odin's presence. While human sacrifice in Viking culture was rare and deeply spiritual, there were moments when these profound rituals took a darker turn, becoming acts of grim and final punishment. The blood eagle. This was a brutal and controversial execution method said to be used by the Vikings. It was both a ritual sacrifice to their gods and a way to punish enemies. In Viking sagas, the condemned were laid on their stomachs before an executioner. Sometimes a high-ranking figure began the gruesome process. The executioner began by making a deep cut across the victim's back, peeling away the skin and muscle. Afterward, the ribs were cut from the spine and pulled outward to form the shape of wings. Salt was then rubbed into the open wound while the victim was still alive. Next, the lungs were pulled out and draped over the wings, creating a terrifying sight. As the victim neared death, their lungs moved gently in the wind, resembling a bird's fluttering wings. Death likely came during or just before the final stages of this gruesome act. This act was meant to honor the gods, particularly Odin, and to intimidate enemies. Famous accounts include the execution of Halfdan Longleg, where it was said his blood eagle was a sacrifice to Odin for victory in battle. Another legendary case was King Aella of Northumbria, who allegedly suffered the blood eagle at the hands of Ragnar Lothbrok's sons as revenge for their father's death. While these stories appear in Norse sagas and some later writings, historians debate whether the blood eagle was ever actually performed. It may have been a form of propaganda, used to enhance the Vikings' fearsome reputation. Whether real or exaggerated, such tales contributed to the Vikings' image as one of the most ruthless groups of the medieval era. No matter how fearless the Vikings appeared, Even they were haunted by a single inescapable fear, the looming end of the world. Ragnarok ritual. About 1,000 years ago, Viking leaders performed elaborate rituals in a volcanic cave in Iceland, hoping to prevent a catastrophic end of the world. This site, hidden deep within the cave and about 980 feet from its entrance, contained a boat-shaped rock structure, along with beads and ornaments sourced from faraway regions. Archaeologists studying the site revealed that the cave, known as Surtshella, was formed by a massive volcanic eruption in the late 9th century, not long after the Vikings first settled in Iceland. This event marked one of the first major volcanic eruptions experienced in northern Europe since the Ice Age, spreading volcanic rock over 90 square miles of fertile land. Such a dramatic event would have deeply unsettled the newly arrived settlers, creating a sense of looming crisis. Shortly after the lava cooled, the Vikings ventured into the cave, building the stone structure and conducting rituals that involved animal sacrifices. They burned bones from livestock like sheep, goats, cattle, horses, and pigs, leaving behind offerings. Historical accounts suggest they associated the cave with Surtur, a powerful figure in Norse mythology who was believed to bring about the end of the world during Ragnarok. For decades, possibly as long as 60 to 80 years, these rituals continued, likely conducted by Iceland's upper class. They may have believed the sacrifices would appease Surtur or empower Freyja, a fertility god who, according to myth, battles Surtur during Ragnarok. These activities ceased when Iceland converted to Christianity, leaving behind evidence of a once vital attempt to confront what the Vikings saw as an existential threat. Among the artifacts discovered inside were orpiment, a yellow pigment originating from eastern Turkey, and 63 beads, some of which came from distant places like Baghdad. These items likely reached Iceland through extensive trade networks, meaning that the Vikings had connections to regions as far as the Islamic world, as evidenced by the discovery of Islamic coins and other foreign objects in Viking burial sites. New research suggests that the shift to Christianity marked the end of rituals performed in the Surtshella cave. One of the final items placed in the rock boat was a set of scale weights, including one shaped like a Christian cross, possibly symbolizing the conclusion of pagan practices at the site. However, elements of the mythology surrounding the cave persisted, with an Icelandic Christian tradition later identifying it as the place where Satan would rise on Judgment Day. Before Christianity spread through Viking lands, they unleashed relentless terror on Christian territories, leaving behind a legacy of unthinkable atrocities. Sexual slavery. The Viking Age is thought to have begun around 793 AD, when raiders, likely from Norway, attacked the Lindisfarne monastery near the northeastern coast of England. For centuries, until 1066, Vikings launched raids on monasteries and villages along Europe's coastline. However, historians have long debated the reasons behind these invasions. One idea suggests that Viking men may have sought women due to an imbalance in the number of men and women caused by practices like selective infanticide. This theory proposes that the primary goal of many Viking raids wasn't just to loot and plunder, but to capture women to take as wives. Modern genetic studies of Icelandic people support this notion. By analyzing mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited from both parents, researchers traced the origins of Iceland's settlers. The results showed that around 80% of the male settlers in Iceland came from Norway, while about 63% of the female settlers had roots in the British Isles. This points to significant intermarriage between Norwegian men and women from the regions the Vikings raided. It's highly unlikely these women chose to migrate to Iceland willingly, suggesting they were taken during Viking expeditions. Living a life of raids, hunting, duels, and wars, the Vikings ensured their most formidable enforcers were passed down through generations, preserving their violent legacy in a way that seemed impossible to break. War heirloom. The Vikings used a variety of weapons, including spears and long axes, with even their shields doubling as tools for attack. Yet their most treasured weapons were their longswords, which held deep personal and cultural significance. These swords often bore names like Widowmaker or Corpse Bramble, and were handed down through generations. As boys grew, their fathers would recount tales of battles fought and enemies defeated with these blades, preserving family stories and emphasizing the honor tied to combat. Viking swords were double-edged and incredibly sharp, capable of slicing through a skull or severing a limb in a single swing. Men carried their swords at all times, often strapped to their backs, and even kept them close while sleeping. Constant conflicts, especially between Viking families or rival groups, made being armed a necessity. Viking men were expected to protect their homes, families, and leaders, as well as defend the property of their rulers in times of strife. And that's all for today. Thanks for watching.